Welcome to the Future Resolution, Miles Mediation and Arbitration's podcast. In this episode, we have managing partner of Buckley Beal in Atlanta, Ed Buckley. Ed is interviewed by Miles mediator and arbitrator David Nutter.
Ed, thanks for being here and letting us be with you. Spend a little time with you. Ed Buckley is one of the pillars and deans of the Plaintiffs' Employment Bar, and it's been my pleasure to get to work with Ed a number of times over the years. So, Ed, we're delighted that you're willing to share some of your time with us and let us share a little bit of your very, very interesting story.
Thank you very much, David.
Ed, let's start with this. Most lawyers are passionate about what they do. Some people that I get to mediate with stand out. You have a tremendous passion for your work as a civil rights plaintiff's lawyer in the pursuit of justice. Where do you get that passion and zeal?
Some of it comes from the way I was brought up. I was raised by some good people. My parents were good folks. My dad was an advocate, a trial lawyer himself. My mother was just always a person who wanted to look out for and protect the weak. As for me, I was a kind of skinny, underdeveloped, asthmatic kid, and sometimes I got picked on and I didn't like it, and every once in a while I got in a tussle over it. So that maybe that is some of it, and then I gravitated kind of naturally to the law because my dad was in it, and after a period of time of trying different areas of trial and litigation practice, I came into civil rights and more specifically employment discrimination law, and I have just taken to it quite naturally.
Yeah, I agree with that. How long have you been doing civil rights work?
Well, in one form or another, David, for just about all of my 38 years of practice. I started doing employment law and employment discrimination law probably 6 years into my practice, but before that, we had a number of cases. One in particular went to the Georgia Supreme Court on an equal protection issue that we represented the mother of a boy who was served an alcoholic beverage and then went out and was in a terrible car wreck. He was served a very strong beverage. And the statute at the time said the father, or if the father is dead, the mother of a child who is served a beverage will have a cause of action for this. And we represented her, and we were dismissed because she was not a man. And we took it up to the Georgia Supreme Court, got that reversed. So I think that was probably my first foray into law that tries to level the playing field between different people of different genders, and just kept going forward from there.
Yeah, and you just said it. Your inclination is to stand for the weaker party in general, right? That's kind of where your heart goes and where your passion is.
That's true.
Yeah. Now, did you start practicing law with your dad's firm?
I did. The name of the firm was Green, Buckley, Jones, and McQueen, and my dad was the managing partner. It was an interesting time because I applied for a position there, and he refused to vote on whether or not I would be allowed to come into the firm. So thankfully, his partners voted in favor of me being hired, and then with every salary increase, and ultimately with the question of whether or not I would be a partner, he abstained from voting. So thankfully, they decided I was worthy, and I sometimes was surprised about that because they were sort of a traditional defense firm, and here I was doing this plaintiff's side, individual rights side practice and sometimes taking positions that some of my partners weren't really all that comfortable with. So it was a surprising way to get into what I do, and I'm still to this day grateful for their support. And I think sometimes their support was against their better judgment.
So you mentioned it's pretty unusual for a dad, I think, to abstain. If there's ever a place of weakness, it's overwhelming with our kids that we can kind of lose sight of balance. But that's your dad, isn't it?
He was that way, and he's a funny guy in that his law partner told me that if you didn't ask him, you wouldn't necessarily know he had kids because he didn't talk about it, because he wasn't a guy to brag about his kids or anything. Maybe there wasn't anything to brag about, but he just was low key about that kind of stuff. And I told you before we started this interview, I first actually worked for that firm doing carpentry work for them. They had a computer room that needed to be built, and so I did that. And as I did it, I met the lawyers there, and I was so impressed and by them. Of course, I was probably easily impressed, but I was very impressed by them, and I decided I wanted to practice law there. I was in law school, and so I made a full court press to get into the firm, and he didn't oppose me doing it. He might have been happy if I'd gone somewhere else, but he was ultimately a great mentor and a great friend that gave me a lot of guidance all through my career.
Yeah, that's a great thing to be able to say about your dad. I remember some years ago, I was in your office and you showed me a letter from your dad that's in this conference room where we're seated that I think speaks a lot about your dad. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. He, now this is in 1974, believe it or not. He was advocating for Maynard Jackson, who ultimately became the mayor of Atlanta, and William Alexander, who became a sitting judge in Fulton County. He was advocating for them to become members of the Atlanta Lawyers Club. At the time, the Lawyers Club had a practice called blackballing, where they would bar any one person could bar somebody from being admitted, and that practice was used to keep Maynard Jackson and Bill Alexander, both of whom were African American, from becoming members of the Lawyers Club. My dad, Ferdinand Buckley, wrote a very eloquent letter, which hangs in this room today, to the Atlanta Lawyers Club, resigning his membership because of that, and pointing out to them that Brown versus Board of Education had already been decided and they needed to get with the times. And he copied some of the then leading lights in the Atlanta bar, copied his letter to them. I think his position was very well thought out, and also at the time a little controversial, but ultimately the Atlanta Lawyers Club integrated as it should.
Yeah. And again, your dad was not, some plaintiff's lawyer, right? He was a part of the defense bar, really.
He was not what you would call a wild-eyed liberal. He was a pretty buttoned-down guy, Roman Catholic, very traditional in his values, but he also was a person that believed in doing the right thing.
Yeah. He had a refined sense of justice that really, I think, in some ways he's passed on to you.
Well, I like to think so.
Yeah.
I like to think so.
Now, your mom, before we move on, tell us a little bit more about your mom and the kind of things she was involved in.
Well, she was, I guess, first of all, I can fairly say, my parents were married, I think, 55 years altogether before my dad passed away. To his last breath, she was the love of his life. Beautiful, beautiful woman. She had a serious back problem that required multiple surgeries, and for much of her adult life, and while I was a kid, was sort of a semi-invalid. She had a hard time getting around and had to sit in special reclining chairs, and often she, I can recall when she had a full body cast at one point after some surgery. She was very, very, perhaps because of this or for other reasons, very compassionate. She and my dad, they sat at the dinner table with us every night. We sat down, had dinner. Kids sat on a bench around the table, and there were 5 of us, and there would be a conversation, about what was going on in the world and what was going on in the community. And she was a very well-read person, and she educated us. The other thing she did was every day when we came home from school, the first stop was our rooms to do our homework before we got to see any daylight outside.
Yeah.
So we got in and we did it, and she checked it and made sure that we were doing the things we were supposed to do before we could go and play.
You might not be sitting here today.
Maybe not.
That. Yeah.
Maybe not.
So before we move on, is there any, other than that amazing story about your dad and the Lawyers Club letter, is there any other distinctive moment of you growing up and coming of age during the civil rights movement that stands out in your memory growing up in Atlanta, which in many ways was one of the hubs of the civil rights movement?
Well, my dad was good friends with Don Hollowell. Don Hollowell was Dr. King's lawyer, or one of Dr. King's lawyers. And he would come home. Our dinner table was sort of a theater for what was going on in the civil rights movement and in politics in general. And so there would be a discussion involving him and my parents. He talked about the way that black lawyers were treated by judges in the courts. Black lawyers would be required to stand behind the bar when there was a calendar call, for example. And would often be called by their first names as opposed to Mr. So-and-so. There were not too many women lawyers at that point in time. There were more, of course, as time rolled on. And he was an advocate of hiring women lawyers in his firm, and sort of broke the ground there on that. But we recall, when John Kennedy, I still recall when John Kennedy was shot. I still recall when Dr. King was shot. And I still recall when Bobby Kennedy was shot.
Yeah.
I can recall a profound sense of mourning in our house when those different events happened, and sort of a resolve that we couldn't let these things pass without becoming more involved. We couldn't just let that defeat us. Kennedy's, we had in our den, we had 2 pictures over the fireplace of 2 photographs. One was of John Kennedy, and the other was of the Pope. and I felt, I don't know if they had equal status, but they certainly had elevated status in our home.
That's great. Okay, let me shift gears a little bit. You mentioned this, and when you had told me about it some time ago, I was really kind of surprised that you did not begin your working life as a lawyer.
Well, no, I was in construction.
Yeah, tell us briefly about that.
Well, I was an English major in college, and I often joke that an English degree is good for getting a job pumping gas or pounding nails. So I did pound nails. I worked on construction sites. I would, rent myself out to different homeowners and do renovations in their homes. Got to be decent at it. I'm not bad with tools. Still know how to measure and cut, and occasionally do. But that was how I earned my livelihood while I was really figuring out what I wanted to do for a living.
Yeah. And it's kind of unusual, really, for someone to be good with words and also be good with their hands. So that's pretty impressive.
Well, I'm still a work in progress on the words.
Yeah. Was there a defining moment when you decided, I'm heading for the law, not carpentry?
Well, when you are cutting and sawing and pounding nails and you're standing on the edge of buildings and hoping you don't fall off, you start to think about alternative careers. I had an accident on a construction site where I fell through a floor and broke a bunch of ribs on one side of my body, and I had been mulling over what I was going to do, and it was about at that time that I think I'm going to go to law school because I may end up getting killed if I keep doing this. And I felt that I was good at reading and writing and running my mouth, and that those things ought to help me in a law practice, and they seem to have helped.
That reminds me of, I read a biography of Judge Alimo, and he was up in like Iowa in the middle of winter working on farm equipment at his father-in-law's farm when he decided, I'm going back to practicing law in Georgia. You reach those points, don't you?
But one of the things is, we think when we're making that decision, that's got to be a lot easier than what I'm doing. And then you start practicing law and you find out it's not really.
Yeah. There's no easy path. Every job has its things, doesn't it? Yes. Did you have a dream when you went to law school of what your career would end up being?
I think I have always gravitated towards the plaintiff side, although I initially started as a defense lawyer. And as I sat in my torts classes and my constitutional law class, I just felt that I was fascinated by how human rights issues percolate to the top, for example, to the Supreme Court, and our society gets changed by it. And I felt I wanted to be a part of that. It fascinated me. It still fascinates me today.
Yeah. And you're a trial lawyer. I mean, have you lost count of how many cases you've tried over the years?
I have.
Yeah.
Quite a few.
Quite a few.
I do. I enjoy, of course, it's preparation. If you're not prepared, you're not going to enjoy it. So I work hard to be prepared. I've been fortunate to work with great lawyers all through my career. I got trained by some really brilliant trial lawyers, and they taught me a lot. And so I try to apply it to the trial. And I like trying cases with other good lawyers, and to me, it's almost an athletic event. It's, if you plan it and you plan execution, and then you take your witness and then you hand off to the next lawyer, and so you've made certain evidentiary points and they get to make some others, and then they hand it back off to you, and you run with the ball. So it's to me very invigorating, very exciting, and it's really an honor to be able to stand in front of a jury and advocate for a client. And it's something I just feel very, very privileged to do.
Yeah, it really is a tremendous battle of wits. There's a lot of smart people in the bar on all sides, and it's a tremendous battle with your fellow member of the bar, isn't it?
And often with the judge that's sitting on the bench, too.
I've had that experience, too.
Yes. And, I've said more than once, I've said, as tough a fight as opposing counsel is giving me, that judge is giving me a hard time, too. And you need to be willing to respectfully lean in with judges sometimes that are hostile to your cases, and preserve the record. And I had a sort of a set to with one of our judges who said, I know exactly what you're doing here, Mr. Buckley. You're trying to preserve the record for appeal, aren't you? And I said, yes, Judge, that's my job.
Yes.
And I said, of course, you have yours and I have mine. And we went on and we tried the case from there on.
Do you have a defining moment or sort of one of your favorite moments you'd want to share of one of your trials, or humor, something that stands out as...
Golly, there's so many, and I think one of the things I want to try not to do is to name names,
Right.
but I was trying a case against a lawyer who is actually a good friend, and part of the case involved some conduct by his law partner who ended up taking the witness stand. And I desperately wanted to get some evidence in about a prior investigation that this guy had done. And the judge told me unequivocally that I couldn't do it. And I shouldn't open my mouth and I shouldn't say anything about it. And so my friend gets up and he's examining his client, his partner, and I know he was trying to prepare him and had prepared him, and the partner blurted out, "Well, there was this prior investigation." And I stood up and I said, "Judge, he's opened the door." And the judge said, "Yes, he has." And I saw my friend kind of choke a little bit, and so we got to get into that evidence. So it was just a funny moment because we were all friends in the courtroom, literally, and my opponent had done a great job in sealing me off, so kicking that door open was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about this is a good friend you're trying a case against. One of the things I love about the bar when it's working at its best is that you can try cases with your friends and you're all working in a systems of justice, but strike hard and fair blows and then laugh about it afterwards, right?
Well, I think that's true. And, my dad said that lawyers are basically problem solvers, and we try to solve problems for our clients. We try to solve problems, and I talk to opposing counsel before we file suit or have a case. I say, we have a problem, right, and we need to solve it. And if we can't solve it between ourselves, we're going to end up solving it and asking a jury to solve the problem. And so basically the jury system is problem solving. There's a dispute between these parties and you all need to solve it. And when you think about it that way, and you think about your job as a lawyer as being a problem solver, it kind of puts it all into a perspective that's maybe different from, I want to get this person or they want to get me or that sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, one thing I've noticed in recent years, Ed, about you is that you've surrounded yourself with a crackerjack team of younger lawyers, cadre of younger lawyers that you really enjoy building into, just like your dad and his colleagues did with you. Do you have any practice tips or practice development tips or trial tips in general that you'd want to share with younger listeners who are just kind of getting their career started?
I think there's so many, but I think the first is probably to have something else that you're passionate about besides practicing law, so that you have that human spirit, that ability to empathize with others. Being an avid reader of fiction is one way. They say people who read fiction are more empathetic. And I think that you gain wisdom from being well-read and from having other life experiences. A person who has to come to the office every day and on the weekends to build time and doesn't get out in the world is not going to be as well-rounded a lawyer as someone who does. So I think, I want people to engage in pro bono activities. I want them to have other outside activities that they're passionate about, because they're going to bring that life experience to their jobs. Right. And it will help them to understand the perspectives of others. We have clients that come in and are utterly broken or think they're utterly broken, and they're despondent, and they've been fired, and they've lost everything. And we have to set any concerns that we have about personalities aside and see whether or not we can help these folks. Often the most difficult clients are the people who have been beat up most badly in the system. And so we need to parse through that to get to solutions. And if you don't have empathy, you can't do that.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about trends that you see in employment and employment law in the USA, now going forward to the next 5 or 10 years. Are there things that you see as someone that's been working in this for nearly a generation that you see developing?
It is, some of what we do is dependent on politics and where our political discussion goes. It depends on bills that may be passed by Congress or bills that may not be passed. So some of it just depends on what direction our politics are going. We have so far, I believe, an independent judiciary. There are those who would say that a given judge is a Democratic judge or a Republican judge. I like to think that once these folks get lifetime appointments, they check their politics at the door and they really try to make the best decision. And one thing about judges that I do know is they hate to be reversed. And so if they are not going to buck precedent, but some of them will try to be as creative as they can be. So I think, just for instance, we have a case right now our firm does is pending before the Supreme Court. And it's the question of whether or not a gay person is protected by Title VII. It's an issue that has been, hotly disputed. Right. The question of that is going to be determined by the court. But regardless of how the court decides it, if they decide it for our client, well, we'd be very happy about that. If the court decides it against our client, then it's going to be up to Congress to decide whether or not their gay relatives, their gay friends, and family members should be treated equally, regardless, in the workplace, regardless of what their sexual orientation is. So that's one example. But I think there are many other areas where the law is still developing, and I'll just take the cat's paw doctrine, for example, the doctrine that even where a decision maker in the workplace may have no discriminatory bias, if the person who is feeding them information concerning an employee has that bias, there can still be a liability for discrimination. And that doctrine, to me, is one that can and should be expanded beyond the workplace into other areas of civil rights. So I'm interested in developing that. We have, as a firm, we have taken a lot of those cases and are, working them, and I think it will develop over the years.
So let me ask you, globalization just is, whether someone likes globalization or not, it's like liking gravity. Globalization, is that positive for employees, negative for employees, neutral? How do you see that impacting
I think it's largely a positive, and I'll tell you why. And I've seen it in the composure of our juries. They're changing. I used to go down to the federal courthouse and the jury pool would be predominantly white, if not sometimes even exclusively white. And often in striking a jury, the jury would end up being all or almost all white. Well, that's changed. You go down to the jury pool now and you see a mix of ethnic groups. It would be impossible or just about impossible to strike a white jury now. So our juries now are of various ethnic groups. That's one example. I'll give you another example. We had a case in Gwinnett County It was a voting rights case. And the concern was that the white majority was writing the district lines in such a way that the minorities couldn't get representatives into county government. Well, ultimately what happened is that the collective minorities, African American, Asian, and Hispanic, just grew by having more children. Yeah. And the collective minority population became the majority. So that changed the demographics up there, and minorities ended up getting into, for example, the county commissioner seats. I think in the changing demographics and globalization will change the voting population as well, and so you're going to see concerns of those populations coming to the forefront more and more in our American politics. So it's here. It's going to stay. This morning in Wall Street Journal, 1 million Syrians are looking for a home right now because they're being driven out of their country. That's one refugee population. There are others. And so this world is changing in white European countries and our country are being changed by this. The pushback, of course, is governments that don't want these populations to cross their borders, and that's a push and pull that'll probably continue for a while.
Yeah. And, I hear in your answer on globalization something similar. You're talking about young lawyers. The broader your perspective, do I hear you saying the closer we can get to the truth?
Well, I think that's true. And it is so important that we, whatever our particular ethnic background is, that we try to understand what's going on in other groups, what their concerns are, what their fears are, what their hopes are. There are core values that we all hold, things that all of us want: housing, education, healthcare, things like that, food on our tables. So if we start looking at some of these common things that we all hold in common, I think that the other things that are important to these different populations are things we can empathize with more and fear less.
Right. And fear is something that can really get in the way of the truth, isn't it?
It can. It's, we only have a lifespan that lasts so long. And at some point, we're all going to go. And we need to stop worrying about who the dominant ethnic group is going to be. And instead, what we need to be concerned about is, how are we all going to get along together?
Yeah. You use the expression push-pull. You and I have used the expression that I see tension in all truth. You want to expand on that a little bit? Anything you want to share about that as you've grown in life?
As you know, being a mediator, and as I know, being a trial lawyer, depending on your side of the equation, truth is what you perceive, or you perceive a certain truth, and then there is truth. The coin is under one of three cups. I perceive it as being under the one on the right, and you perceive it as being under the one on the left, but in reality, it's under the one in the middle. And so, but I have a perceived truth, and I may advocate for the cup on the right very, very hard until we discover it's in the middle. And I guess that's a little metaphor for the truth often lies somewhere in the middle between the two polar opposites of the argument.
Yeah, and so I'm definitely not shoving you into an overt political discussion here. However, I'm interested in your thoughts about process that what about our process or culture could we as a people be pursuing to try to bring more unity? I think everyone from all political perspectives is concerned about the lack of unity in these days. What do you see that maybe we all could be doing differently, or this system could be doing differently to try to promote that getting to the middle truth you were talking about?
I think what we need to focus on, and when I say we, I mean all of us, is what do we have in common? I think that's the starting point for the discussion. We all have differences, but what are the things that we can all agree on? We spend way, way too much time arguing about what we disagree on, but there are certain core things that we all agree on. We all want to be able to worship or not worship, in our own way, pursuant to our own religion or faith. We want to do that. We all want what's best for our children. We all want some sense of security in our homes, in our housing. We want to feel that our families are safe. We want health care. We want a job that we can go to and have a sense of self-respect. So if we focus on those things, and instead of saying, calling something an ism, socialism or fascism or whatever, set those isms aside and talk about what people hold in common and what they all need, and start there, and then we can worry a little more about, well, I don't agree with you that you think this way, or you don't agree with me that I think that way, but here are the larger things, are the things we agree on. I think we got to do that. I also think we need to respect the fact that we have three branches of government, that they are in fact co-equal, and try, and that's another push-pull, as you know, try not to allow any one branch to supersede the others.
I think at the time, I don't think any of us appreciated the significance of it the way we do now, but the idea of Reagan and Tip O'Neill having a pint together, there's a lot to that, actually, that I'd love to see recaptured, wouldn't you?
Well, I agree that things are very, very fractionalized now, balkanized, if you want to say that, and it's not serving the greater interests of the country. Not getting things done is not helping us. Having bills that sit and don't get passed isn't helping anybody. So there needs to be this effort towards commonality. Ted Kennedy used to have some kind of a barbecue cookout and cook-in in his Senate chambers, and everybody was invited. It didn't matter what political party a person belonged to. And business got done. They disagreed, no question about it, but they also got business done. And I would really like to see a return to that. We can always be hopeful.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about that. You mentioned mediation. You've been nice enough to do some of your mediation stuff with me, and I know you're a extensive user of that process. When you and I both started practicing law, there was no mediation out there. What about that process have you found useful in your practice?
Well, I think that conciliation, where you can find it, is desirable for everybody. It's good for people to finally get their dispute resolved and then go about whatever other important business they have. In the case of my clients, it might be finding another job, or it might be getting on with their career. In the case of management, it may be they can stop focusing on this lawsuit that's been filed and they can start focusing on their business, or focus more on their business. So conciliation is good. I can't say that there aren't cases where the law, for example, needs to be developed, and you just have to bring them. But in many garden variety disputes, I think it's good to get to the table. And you're right. Lawyers used to be able to pick up the phone and talk to each other and make an offer and make a counteroffer and ultimately resolve a case. Sometimes that still occurs, but lawyers, it seems more and more, feel that their clients need to hear from a neutral who doesn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, and who can assess their position and maybe discuss with them their strengths and weaknesses. Yeah, I see your point here, but on this other point, there's some evidence that isn't so good for you. I mean, I think that's helpful, and it helps to give clients perspective.
Yeah, and it can be a useful foil in that way for the attorney, where you're not just the bad guy for your client.
And I think also, too, mediation takes a process that could take months or even years, and it compresses it into a day or two, and you're resolved, and your client can move on with their lives, and they don't have to spend quality time with their lawyer preparing for depositions or reviewing documents.
Yeah, and so in the best moments, perhaps sometimes it functions the same thing as Ted Kennedy's barbecue. When it works its best. So.
When it works its best.
Do you? Is there a hard and fast rule you have for making a substantive opening statement to the other side at a mediation or not? Or do you just kind of do it depending on the field? Does that matter?
I have evolved. And some of the mediators that I've worked with really, really discourage opening statements. And the reason that they do is they don't want lawyers making their what amounts to their fire and brimstone closing argument where they vilify the other side and everybody ends up being upset. That's not a good way to start a mediation. So when I do an opening statement now, I generally try to speak in terms not of you're a bad guy and we're the good guys, but instead in terms of process and what we believe the evidence will show, and that we are here in the spirit of conciliation to resolve our dispute. So I've certainly softened my delivery over time because I've found that poking the other side in the eyes as you start a conciliation is not perhaps the best way to begin.
Yeah, it's taken me kind of a lifetime to sort of start getting to the same truth there. Well, let's shift gears. You mentioned you try to provide an environment for your younger lawyers to develop other interests and passions outside of just the law so that we're not one-dimensional people. You have a lot of other interests and things you do. You're to me, a very interesting person. One of those things that I've learned about is Water Life Hope. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Water Life Hope is a nonprofit that I started. I started thinking about clean water projects when I was reading a book actually, which mentioned the need for clean water systems in various deprived areas of the world. And I started doing some research and decided that I wanted to try and do that there was a very strong need in the Caribbean particularly, and that I wanted to start getting into that. So I contacted various nonprofits, talked to them about it and what they were doing, and worked with a couple of them, and then decided that I would partner with them, and that the best way to do that was do a nonprofit. We focused on a few countries, Haiti being the predominant one, and we picked Haiti because it's just the most impoverished area in this hemisphere. And they have a terrible lack of clean water. So we started putting water reservoirs and artesian wells in the ground all over the country. In fact, we've put in now 300 and some odd artesian wells and
in Haiti.
Wow. And a number of reservoirs all over the country. We've also worked in Jamaica. We've worked in Honduras, and we're getting ready to do a project in the Dominican Republic. So we've tried to bring clean water to areas where people were really just consuming contaminated water, and it was creating all kinds of health problems. Yeah. And it's made a difference, but there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah. Now, do you take a construction team with you? Or are you doing the construction yourself?
I work in partnership with other nonprofits in doing that. One of the predominant nonprofits I work with is Food for the Poor, and they work with me, and we contract with drilling companies, for example, if we're doing wells. Or with other contractors. Now, the other thing is, and in a lot of these instances, the people in the area that's being served by the system will be actively involved in the building, for example, of a reservoir, carrying the stones, laying the pipes under supervision. And part of the reason for that is so that they're invested in the improvement in their community.
Right. Do you take a team with you when you go on trips?
I take people who are interested in knowing more about what we do and who may be interested in donating to the cause so that they can see, we sort of show them before and after. We show them areas that really need help, and then we show them areas where we've been able to make a difference. And we, say, and I really don't say much. I just want folks to observe, and then I'll ask them later on, what did you see? And get their impressions from that.
So your involvement with Water Life Hope, have you seen that change you in any way? I find that as I do these sorts of things, that as much as anything, it changes me.
Absolutely. It has made me understand, for one thing, how petty some of the concerns that we have are when I'm seeing folks that don't have the basics in life. But more than that, in meeting and getting to know people who have little or nothing and seeing how much more at peace they are with their own lives, it helps me to find that peace in my own life. It helps me to realize that so many of my concerns really shouldn't be concerns at all. And that very basic values are what our lives are all about. I went to the top of a plateau one day with Delane Bailey, a caseworker, and we were up at the top of this plateau, and there were probably 100 people sitting up there meditating. They're reading their Bibles and things like that, and they were all people who lived in significant poverty. And yet, compared to where I was at that time in my life, what I observed there, they were far more at peace than I was. And I longed for that feeling. And I walked away from that situation with a little more of it. So I'm getting at least as much, if not more, out of this whole thing than anyone that we serve.
That seems to be the way it always is. You're a novelist. I have read your first novel, All the Way Home, and I'm not going to give away the story because I want everyone to get it. It's a wonderful book, but it's rich with characters, and as you describe your own upbringing. I see some of the threads of that built into the story. So, how did you come to write a novel?
Well, writing is great therapy, and I probably have saved tens of thousands of dollars in therapy fees by doing it. It's a yarn, it's a story, and we write what we know, and so there are characters that are based on people I know. There's a trial lawyer in there who's a very interesting character, I think, and there are some trials. But it's also a book about things that I think are important. Reconciliation, forgiveness, things that are important to our own personal growth. And I, as I wrote, I think I was writing what I knew, but I think that I was drawing from other people that I knew. And I think even that was a bit of a learning process for me. I found I knew myself a little better when I finished it than I did before. I had a great affection for these fictitious characters. I think one of the things about that book was ultimately there weren't any bad guys. There were characters that had problems and issues and concerns and worries, and they were all people that I found myself having affection for. So it was easy to write a chapter and then sit back and say, well, I think I'll write another because I like these people.
Yes. I'm not sure I had noticed that quite, but once you say it, it's true. And everybody needs redemption. One of the points I'm coming to is we're all the prodigal son. The question is, do we recognize it or not, right?
True. Yeah.
So the character, I wouldn't put this burden on you, but the characters are amazingly memorable, like a Dickens novel or story. You obviously must be a keen observer of people, because I just love the characters in this book.
Well, there's a little sign in my office, which is a joke, really, but it says, "I am silently correcting your grammar," and I enjoy of course, I enjoy meeting clients, and I can sit with a client, and they'll tell me all about the work that they do. And I walk away just thinking they're brilliant, of course, but there's somebody that's brought a problem, to the table. And I find that I spend a lot more time admiring people than not admiring them. And I spend a lot more time trying to find the good in people. What is the thing that I like the most about this person? Then, gee whiz, what's the thing that I just detest about them? That helps me get through the day. When we see people who are troubled, I think what we need to look for is the strength that particular individual has, and try to draw on that strength to maybe help them get to the place that they need to get. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. Yeah, and I have found in my own experience as a more and more, what I really like about mediation is just meeting the people and trying to help people get to the better place.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
So healing plays an important role in this book, and really miraculous type healing. You have some of your own experience with that. Is there anything about that journey you would want to share in a public way to encourage somebody else?
Well, there's many kinds of healing. There's physical healing. I had a very serious health setback about 8 years ago, and I was hospitalized for 3 weeks on life support, and managed to survive. I don't think I survived solely, although my doctors were wonderful. Sure. My doctors were wonderful. The nurses were wonderful. everybody in there, including the people that wheeled me around from room to room, were wonderful. And I tried to thank them by giving them CDs either of the Allman Brothers or of Andy Griffith's stand-up comedy routines. I gave that in particular to my surgeon before he did surgery, and so that he would appreciate me a little more as he cut into my body.
Yes, yeah.
But I think also too, because I had that point where I probably could have checked out, but I felt so much affection from so many people, and so much love that I felt the need to stay, and the desire to stay, and the feeling that I had more that I needed to do. So it was almost as if you feel like you're getting ready to go somewhere, but there are people that are holding you back, and I definitely felt that. And it was a path towards healing. I'm now in very good health, but even when I got out of the hospital, I had probably 6 months where it was touch and go. But I just kept, taking each day as it came, and managed to sort of plow through.
Yeah, and you come out different, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And you appreciate life so much more. Every day is a great day. It'll have problems, but then you just look at them as problems and not as, oh gosh, this is just the most gosh awful thing that ever happened. It's just a problem.
Yeah. Well, and I see some of that in your novel, All the Way Home. How do people get All the Way Home if they want to read your novel?
They can go to Amazon and there, or they can go to Barnes and Noble. They can buy it at either of those sites, and they just need to, if they type in the name All the Way Home and they type in my name, Edward D. Buckley, it'll pop up. And I do have to say it's very reasonably priced.
Great, yeah. So tell me, do you have a thought or a vision for the next 5 or 10 years, what you see yourself doing or want to be doing in the next 5 or 10?
Well, I'm having a lot of fun practicing law, and I'm enjoying working with some very bright lawyers here at our firm. And so I am not thinking, I'm going to retire at a certain point or anything like that. I think as long as I'm having a good time, and as long as I'm having problems that intrigue me and challenge me, that I'll probably keep doing it. I do like to write. I write poetry. I am working on another novel. It's actually a sequel to All the Way Home, and I still like to build things. I have this little builder's gene in me that I always seem to want to do something. So I'm going out I've got a dock I'm working on in Alabama. I'm going to go out and work on that this weekend. And, I think I'll do that. The only other thing is I want to get a dog, and my wife tells me that I need to retire first. So I don't want to retire, but I want a dog. So we are negotiating that point.
That your answer is very similar to his report that John Wesley was asked if he was given one more day to live. He knew that. What would he do? And he said, I'm doing it.
Well, that's good.
That's a good answer. Yeah. Any closing remarks?
No, I've enjoyed this great, David, and I feel honored that you've chosen me to interview. I was talking to Patricia Martinez, my assistant, and I said, I have no idea why he wants to talk to me, but I'm glad to have the opportunity. And, I enjoy life. I enjoy what I'm doing, and I think that if there's any message I can get to people is step back and get a perspective on things. You've got it a lot better than you think you do. And enjoy what you have, and continue on, and you will have a fortunate and blessed life.
Yeah, well, that joy shines through, and people I know will be interested in that. Ed, thanks so much for sharing your time.
You bet, Dave.
Thank you.
All right.
You've been listening to The Future of Resolution, the podcast. You can follow The Future of Resolution on Miles Mediation and Arbitration's Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, and subscribe, rate, or review this podcast. Join us soon for another interesting discussion. Thank you for listening.